With the airport now under the control of the city, the 1960s and 70s saw a colorful array of new businesses, new airline companies, visits by presidents, heads of state, and kings and queens. The airport also became home to one of aviation's most unusual and useful endeavors.
Jack Conroy, he was of course, the president of Aerospace Lines, a new company. He liked Santa Barbara, and so it was his idea to move the whole operation to Santa Barbara, and which was highly unadvisable, according to everybody else, because of the fact that it was so remote from Burbank and so on, where the labor pool was. But that didn't stop Jack. He dragged us up here.
We used to go to the ends of the runway and watch the jets take off and land. And we were always fascinated by the guppies. I remember when, the first one arrived. That was always something of great fascination to everyone, how they looked and how they were made from, pieces of other planes.
I heard it was coming in, but I didn't even know what it was. And it came in and landed, and it's just a magnificent thing. It's huge. It shouldn't be flying. It's like a bumblebee.
Here's this giant airplane that kind of looks like a huge whale.
You could see it coming from way down by Ventura, and it looked like a big blimp or a big whale coming towards you.
The weirdest part about the Guppy was watching it land, because it didn't land normal like most aircraft where the nose is up a little bit. It's almost like a flat landing.
When it came to building the Guppy, it wasn't really his idea. He was sitting in one of the bars in Van Nuys, and somebody mentioned that there was no way that they had to move the Saturn missiles. They were too wide to go on a train. They couldn't put them on a ship because it'd be destroyed by the salt air. Couldn't put them on a truck. So now that they built them, they couldn't move them. So he said, the same guy said, gee, I don't know why somebody doesn't just build an airplane big enough to take it.
They were building missile components in Southern California that you couldn't get across the United States on a train. They were too big. So the opposite, you don't want to ship them, it would take forever. And that's what spawned the airplane. NASA still owns a couple of them.
The airplane was big enough to swallow a Saturn missile, and that was why they built the airplane. They shoved the missile in, fly the missile to whatever site it had to go for its launch. Then they'd fly back, get another missile, and do the same thing. So the airplanes are shuffling back and forth to these missile sites.
Great guy. He had so many wonderful ideas for aviation that we used to joke that if we put him in a cage and just kept him there, he could come up with all these wonderful ideas on like the Guppy, and then the airplane with negative gravity. He designed something similar to the space shuttle before they ever had the space shuttle.
He made it all happen against all odds, and he had a really good product for the time, and it can't be underestimated the impact it had on the space program, because it was pretty monumental.
Warner von Braun stated that it was the best piece of equipment that he had to get the men onto the moon.
They had it filled with bags of flour, I think it was. And in a dive test, the upper portion above the cockpit wasn't structured quite strong enough, and it caved in, and then suddenly they had flour all over. It was sort of a chaos, especially the way it opened up. It opened up in the front, if I remember right. Kind of swung out and weird. But just took someone like Conroy to do it.
We used the Guppy several times when we built a full-size engineering unit of the Mobile Lunar Laboratory, which was, as I said, an 8,000-pound big vehicle. When we delivered it to NASA, we used the Guppy. Drove right into the Guppy, and then they flew it to Huntsville, Alabama.
Well, there were no facilities for us until the airport moved those old warehouse buildings for us.
They started building the number 3 Guppy here in Santa Barbara about the time I graduated from high school, and my father was friendly with the people that were working on it. And he said, hey, if you need some help, my son would come out here and just do cleanup work for you. And they said, oh, well, send him out and apply for a job. So I went out there and applied for a job with a man by the name of Maurice Asum, and he was a German designer and very capable airplane builder and modifier. And so I went to work there as a sheet metal mechanics assistant. And the majority of my job for the first few months consisted of just bucking rivets, which is you're holding a steel bar on the other side of the aircraft, and there's a technician on the other side that's shooting the rivet with an air gun. And we built the whole number 3 Guppy, which was called the Mini Guppy. It was the first wide floor Guppy, and it was built on Hollister Avenue right across the street from where the E-Bar is. The part that surprised me the most was how they went about the work. You would think it would be more organized or that it would be more done in a big factory. But essentially they took this airplane and they taxied it across the street to the north side where the big hangar is on the north side of Hollister Avenue. They taxied that airplane over there and set it up on jack stands and proceeded to just cut it apart. And we proceeded to just modify it right there. Basically in an uncovered area. Later on, they came along and they built a superstructure over it to protect us from the rain during the winter. There was very little stuff that we had to work with, and we managed to modify that complete airplane, and it was very amazing to see what they accomplished with so little.
I remember on the Turbo 3, Conroy was, of course, flying it, and he feathered the 2 outboard engines and was just flying across with this the nose engine. And I could probably almost see his smile from the ground.
That was a wonderful era. There were a lot of things going on at this airport at that time.
He's got about 2 wheels on the ground. He's a big rooster tail out of all 4 wheels.
The space program brought many innovative businesses to the Santa Barbara Airport, including the Lunar Rover developed by General Motors engineering director Frank Pavliks.
To begin with, the temperature range between night and day is from minus 250 degrees F to plus 250. Besides, there is total vacuum on the moon. There is no atmosphere. And then the gravity is only 1/6 of Earth gravity. So all these conditions had to be considered in designing such a moon operating vehicle.
NASA first contracted with General Motors to design, build, and test an entire mobile laboratory for lunar exploration. The large 8,000-pound pressurized vehicle was designed to accommodate 2 astronauts for 14 days.
The problem was that it would have required a separate Saturn V launch rocket. So they would send the Apollo spacecraft with the 2 people on. Then they would have to send up this vehicle right next to them so they can then use it for exploration. Now NASA found out that they don't have the money. So they canceled that MOLAB project after we already developed and built full-size test vehicles, which they actually tested in the Mojave Desert. And they gave up on vehicles on the moon altogether. The scientific community, of course, wanted to explore the moon and do some geological surveys and go far away from where they landed. So they were pushing for a mobility for the astronauts. And we at General Motors Research, we followed up on this possibility and came up with a concept which could be compatible with the already designed lunar lander. With this idea, where the vehicle would have been folded together to fit a very small corner of the lunar lander. That was one of the biggest problems. It's involved something like putting a Jeep-sized vehicle into the back of a station wagon. So we took this model to Huntsville, Alabama, where the NASA Center was located. And after our presentations, the engineers there suggested to show it to von Braun. By remote control, I guided the vehicle into his office, right to his desk. And he was on the telephone at the time. He was watching this little thing coming in without seeing anybody else. And finally, he took down the phone, got up, we came into his office, and then explained about the whole concept. How is it possible to do, how it folds up. And he came very excited about it. And a few months later, we received a contract to design, develop, and build these lunar rovers.
I know there was a lunar landscape out behind their building that you could see when you flew over it. It was very amusing. It was a carved bit of land that you think, oh, look, lunar landscape.
So we could use that as a small training facility, craters and hills and boulders and so on. But for larger training, we took them out to Pismo Beach.
And that was another thing. That was in another era. The whole NASA thing was going on simultaneously. So it brought us the Guppy. It brought us that. It brought a lot of people that were very technically oriented into aviation.
We were one of the first organization who started this before Hughes came out for the Santa Barbara Research Organization, and then Raytheon set up their organization, and eventually the GM Research Lab became known as Delco Operations.
While innovative businesses continue to expand at the airport and nearby, the airport infrastructure struggled to keep up.
Atrocious, for lack of a better word. It was built back in the 50s, and it reflected that. We had major leaks, air conditioning problems, heating problems, equipment failures. The city of Santa Barbara, which was the airport proprietor, actually owned the old tower, and they would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year trying to upkeep it to maintain the safety standards that were required.
The airport runways were also in transition.
They had a pretty good sized jet that came in all the time, because I worked on the airport crew in the summer of 1965 or 66, and they were constantly trying to get the runway to handle the weight. This thing was actually denting the runway, it was so heavy. So they started pouring big patches of concrete, concrete 12 inches thick, and after a while it worked. But that's kind of the nuts and bolts transition from regular propeller traffic to jet traffic.
It had been raining, and the creek had backed up, and I decided to come out early to find out if we were really going to open or not, because our prime concern was safety of the controllers and the technicians also. We got here, there were already a couple of controllers came in early on their own to staff up and get ready to go. And it was literally airplanes that were not tied down. It should have been, were just sort of sweeping their way down the runways or the taxiways. Had a controller who lived in Santa Maria, came all the way in, and his wife was 8.5, 9 months pregnant. Got to the facility, wasn't here 10 minutes, and the phone rang, and it was his wife. She was in labor. We couldn't get out of the tower. There was just no way. The water was 7 or 8 feet deep behind the tower. So a petroleum helicopter offered to come over, and they come over and they plucked him off the tower and flew him to Santa Maria so he could be home for his first child's birth. The reason I say that way is it's the uniqueness of the airport. It's everybody working together. The airport proprietor, the users, the air traffic control system, everybody comes to work with a stake in how successful we are. We built a state-of-the-art air traffic control facility which was mimicked redone several other places because of the uniqueness of it. And due to the size, we were able to be the test bed for many state-of-the-art enhancements to the air traffic system.
In the early 1970s, the airport briefly became a venue for something very different from air traffic or business. It involved one of the largest gatherings on airport property ever seen.
On May 8th of 1972, a friend of mine called and said that Nixon had mined Haiphong Harbor, the port for Hanoi, which was kind of a dangerous, provocative act because the Russians were in and out of there providing humanitarian and military assistance. So there was going to be a big meeting on campus out behind the USEN in order for people to understand what was going on and to see if there's some way we could demonstrate our displeasure with that. But then Jim Gregory, who was the editor and writer for the News and Review, the local weekly entertainment and political rag at the time, he suggested that Governor Reagan, a noted war hawk, was arriving that afternoon at the airport, that we should go down to the airport and shut it down and prevent him from coming, and that would be a statement. Well, everybody was kind of nudging each other, clapping, you know, and so about 2 o'clock, we started down Los Caneros. 2,000 or 3,000, 4,000 people.
Oh, they came in on the west end of the airport and they marched across the runway and they had hopes that they would see the airplanes come in and then all of a sudden have to divert, but they didn't realize the tower had diverted the airplanes long before they got here. They milled around out there for a while and then they spray painted some words on the runway, and they weren't nice words of all. It was peaceful. I mean, they just kind of dispersed and went away.
The sheriff came out and announced that we had to disperse. It was an unlawful crowd. And we looked down the runway, and way at the end, there were 6 across, 2 deep, black and whites, sitting there. They were kind of waving in the light of the heat of their engines. And he ordered them to start. And they start coming up the runway towards us, and about half the crowd splits. But we held our ground, I guess you could say. And about halfway towards us, the sheriff called them off, and they stopped. And everybody cheered, and somebody came out and announced that the rest of the flights for the day had been canceled. So we had won, and we stayed another half hour, 45 minutes, I guess.
Many times, the challenges of managing the Santa Barbara airport came from even more unexpected sources.
It was a unique experience. My 3rd or 4th day here, we were visited by the Secret Service, the FBI, the Air Force, many entities, and put together, even back then, a plan for arrivals and departures to the president via helicopter to the ranch. We also had many contingency plans in place, which we used sometimes. But each visit of the president was unique. We would always know well in advance when the president was coming. There were additional security constraints implemented here at the airport, also at the ranch. We would always have pre-assembly meetings with the key parties to ensure that everybody understood when the president would arrive and how he would arrive. And there were several times where he was unable to land at the ranch because of fog, and he had to divert into Santa Barbara by a helicopter. The effort between the Secret Service and all the government entities, including the city of Santa Barbara, the airport proprietor, did a first-class job of providing service to the president and his entourage.